This case, the Lian O11 Dynamic Mini has water cooling written all over it. After all, it was designed in cooperation with Der Bauer, an overclocking specialist. I played around with a few AIO configurations, so today let's take a look at what orientation makes the most sense. Alright, welcome to Machines and More. I built up this O11 Dynamic Mini as a GPU test system, and it houses a rather powerful, but also power-hungry Intel i9 10850K, and this CPU will be on its own open loop after all the testing is complete. But for now, I wanted to get you some inferences on how best to place your radiator and the rad fans for an AIO. I'll also briefly discuss case fan layout. In the first video in this series, I covered the possible radiator configurations, and I'd recommend checking that out if you haven't already, just to get the rundown on the basic specs. To kick things off, the optimization will be done mainly from the perspective of gaming usage with a liquid-cooled CPU and an air-cooled, stock, horizontally mounted GPU. If I had to guess, this will probably be the most common setup for folks building in this case. In short, the case is pretty flexible when it comes to closed-loop rad placement, especially with a micro-ATX or mini-itx board, but we do have to think about the interaction between the GPU's exhaust and also limit the tested configurations to the ones that actually make sense. So it's really easier to first eliminate some configurations by establishing some constraints. Now, first off, when using an air-cooled GPU, you typically want to avoid blowing radiator exhaust directly at the GPU's intake fans. Running fans as an exhaust at the bottom also steals that airflow away from the GPU's fans, so a bottom-mounted radiator isn't the ideal configuration, regardless of fan orientation. It's also not the optimal way to mount a closed-loop rad due to air bubbles that will migrate up into your CPU pump block. And unless you're fully water-cooled for both the CPU and the GPU, I'd reserve the bottom for case fans only, which you should definitely run with an air-cooled GPU. The reason GPU thermals are so good in this case is due to that ability to run those bottom intakes to feed that graphics card fresh air. We also want to avoid configurations that utilize the AIO rad as an exhaust so as to avoid using hot case air to cool the CPU rad. With that in mind, we're actually only left with two possible configurations to test. And initially, I set up my 280 as a side intake, and it performed quite acceptably there. So that's the first configuration I'll formally test and benchmark. But you can also mount at the top, provided you are using that 3-slot or 5-slot configuration. Mounting at the top is great placement for an AIO, as that enables any air bubbles to collect in the radiator instead of the CPU pump block. Running the AIO fans as an intake means channeling ambient outside air through the radiator, which is more effective. So the other configuration I tested was fans running as an intake. In this configuration, since I initially ran 3 top 120mm exhaust fans, I just moved 2 down to the side and set those up as exhaust also. There was one extra fan I also wanted to test at the rear, so I added that into the comparisons as well. So I tested 3 different ways: a CPU-only Blender render, a GPU-focused Unigine Heaven 4.0 run on the Founders Edition 3080 for 15 minutes, and finally for the combined scenario, Red Dead Redemption 2 at 1440p high/ultra, which represents a GPU limit but still with moderate CPU usage. I didn't overclock the CPU yet. Instead, I locked it to the highest stocked boost clock of 4.8 GHz and a reasonable voltage at 1.2 volts, actually delivered by the Gigabyte Z490 Aorus ITX motherboard. Case fans are a combination of Noctua's S12A Chromax, and the bottom fans are the initial Master Fan Halos I started out with, and they are locked to 800 RPM. The rad fans are locked at 1200 RPM, GPU fans at 50%, for a total system noise of about 3 decibels above the noise floor. So let's take a look at the thermal data for the CPU render first. Functionally speaking, there's not a whole lot of difference between any of these configurations. In fact, I'd say they're well within measurement error. They're all relying on outside air for intake, so that's the ideal scenario for the CPU's cooling. How bad is exhausting though? I tested with a side-mounted radiator in exhaust just to show why that is not a good setup. Yeah, that just about illustrates why radiator as an exhaust, even without the GPU active, isn't as optimal a configuration. The difference between cooler ambient air and warm case air for radiator cooling is fairly significant. Next up, a GPU-heavy benchmark in Heaven 4.0. The side-mounted radiator with a rear fan seems to be the favorite configuration for GPU thermals, and perhaps it's not a surprising finding, but it's nice to know the rear fan adds another layer of help to the GPU by getting the exhaust out of its vicinity. With cards that exhaust out the sides, this would be a more prominent effect, since that exhaust has more of a possibility of being re-intaked. With the flow-through cooler design of the Ampere FE cards, the partial exhaust at the top is already pushed away from the card towards that rear vent, so while there is some benefit, it's not enormous. If you have a fan, I'd definitely recommend running it there. Finally, for GPU thermals in the gaming test, it's more or less the same story, with the side radiator intake and rear fan exhaust combo yielding the best GPU thermals. No surprises there, just like we saw in Unigine Heaven. As for the CPU, the top intake with the rear fan is a great combination, but so are either side intake options. And as if we needed any more convincing that a radiator in exhaust is a bad idea, here the side-mounted radiator as an exhaust yields CPU thermals that are 12 to 13 degrees worse, and it's especially bad considering that the CPU isn't even at full utilization yet, and the effect of the GPU is especially noticeable here. So, while for CPU thermals, there's a marginal difference between top and side intakes, I think that for best GPU thermals while gaming, users will be best served running the AIO radiator as a side intake and using a rear exhaust fan. If you are using a 360, you realistically only have the top mount option, and in that scenario, you'd be just as well running it as a top intake and then mount those side exhaust fans to quickly flush out the GPU's hot exhaust. The good news for users is that if you're running an ATX board, the side intake is a great option for a 240 or 280. And for mini-itx and mini-itx users, if you can run a 360, the top mount as an intake is also a very, very good option. I'll be testing with a very interesting 360mm cooler next, and we will also discuss air cooling configs at some point. Feel free to check in with any questions you might have. I have left the full build list link down below, so please feel free to peruse it if you'd like to support the work here. And also please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Hope you're enjoying the O11 Dynamic Mini, and thanks for watching today.